Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have you here today for our second webinar in our Operationalizing Locally Led Development series. This one is on debunking the myths of operationalizing locally led development. We are excited to have a great audience for this webinar, and I'm going to do a few introductory housekeeping items before handing it over to our panel. So first, I'd like to thank our sponsor and our industry partners. The sponsor is Western Union Business Solutions, and our industry partners help to support all of our activities for our members and the larger community. Additionally, we do have some upcoming other webinars, including additional webinars in this series, which I will link in the chat in a moment. And our members receive access to other benefits. So as we prepare for this webinar, I would like to just highlight a few items. We are recording, and you will receive the recording if you registered in a follow-up email. That email usually goes out about 48 hours after the event, so you can expect to see it Friday, or depending on your work day, it may be Monday morning when you log in after the weekend. We also do have subtitles available, so you can turn those on or off by clicking the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you should see something that says live transcript if you are in the most up-to-date Zoom, and you can click on that, and you should see show or hide subtitles, and you can toggle to your preference. We will be spotlighting the speakers today, so you're welcome to have your video on if you would like to, but they will be able to see one another's faces spotlighted. And so while we love the audience engagement, I'm sure that they will be focusing on the conversation with one another. So this is an opportunity to join a webinar without cameras. If you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them into the chat. I'll highlight that in a moment. And we will address those at the end of the conversation, or if they are particularly relevant, we'll be moderating it, but we'll try our best to include them, but we do have a Q&A period at the end. If you have any technical issues or questions that you would like asked anonymously, you can change your selection and message me privately. My name is Jessica Walker with Humentum, and I will make sure that we assist you or get your question asked as we can. With that, I think that's everything. So I am very excited to hand it over to Dr. Christine So, our CEO and president of Humentum.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone, and wow, Jessica, I am just seeing nothing but myself. I hope that goes away. Anyway, welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm really thrilled to have our wonderful panelists joining us today. As Jessica said, this is the second webinar in our series on locally led development, and you can look forward to future webinars pretty much every other month for the coming months on this really relevant topic. Today, we are going to be really talking about the myths that exist around working with local partners and how we think that these myths contribute to locking local partners out of being able to be fully competitive and fully powerful in the development sector. And we are talking with 4 people who work for international NGOs, but also work within their own geographies, some of them, and have deep experience working both at the global level, but also in partnership with local and national partners. And so I am going to invite all of our panelists to really speak both from their professional perspective, but also from their personal and lived experiences in this area, and to not hold back, to really share their experiences and their thoughts on these myths, and especially what we can do to debunk them, to shift the narrative so that when we hear USAID or another donor say we want to, have dynamic, true, legitimate partnerships with local partners and local organizations, we don't then see them run into a roadblock because their own bureaucracy, their own rules and regulations, their own standards, self-imposed standards, get in the way of being able to engage with the very organizations that they are encouraging everyone to be working with. So at Humentum, we really focus on operationalizing equity. We focus on, lots of people are doing great, big, high-level thinking, but Humentum really looks at how do you translate that high-level thinking into practical application to move all of this forward. We can have all of the big thoughts that we want, but again, if we run into bureaucracy and rules and procedures that are structured for an old way of working, they are going to get in the way of making progress on the locally led development agenda. So that is the brief introduction that I wanted to give to today's session. Again, we're really excited to have everyone with us. We've got lots of people signed up for the webinar, and I see you all joining. Jessica has already mentioned, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat throughout the session. We will be doing our best to pull your comments and questions from chat and integrate them into our discussion. So don't wait for the end to put something in. Please feel free to do it during the course of the discussion. We will also stop with 20 or 30 minutes to go and really focus on what we see in the chat and what we're hearing from you and open it up so that we can have a question and answer session with all of the participants on today's webinar. Finally, I will just say, some of you may have seen me moderate things in the past. I really encourage discussion. I do not look to this for a way for us to lecture the participants. This is something that I'm hoping all of our panelists will engage dynamically in, and again, we will pull in your comments and questions. So with that, I am actually going to switch over to today's conversation. I want to welcome our panelists in no particular order, the order I see them on my screen. We have Haidy Wijaya, who is a finance director with World Vision Uganda. Harriet Robina Gimbo from ActionAid. She's now working at the global level, but has worked at the local and national level, again in Uganda previously. Tessie San Martin, who is the CEO of FHI 360 that has operations throughout the world. And George Were, who is with CRS, Catholic Relief Services in Nairobi, and is working at the regional level. So thank you all for joining us today. I also invite our participants and attendees in the webinar to look up these different panelists from the links that you've been provided. If you are interested in more information on their respective biographies, I'm not going to use our precious discussion time to go over that because you can find it elsewhere. So with that, again, thank you to our panelists for joining us. Just briefly, 3 of the myths that we have highlighted for today's discussion, which are by no means the only ones circulating out in the global development sector. I will go over them quickly. Myth number 1, that local organizations are inherently more prone to fraud and mismanagement of funds. Myth number 2, local organizations don't have the capacity needed to engage in donor procurement and compliant processes. And myth number 3, local organizations lack the capacity to implement programming, and therefore their capacity must be built from the ground up. So those are 3 what I would call conversation starters, because again, those are some of the things that are getting in the way of moving towards locally led development, but by no means the only ones. And I am going to start with asking our panelists to speak a little bit about the experience that they may have had with these various myths that I've just cited, or with other ones, and how they have seen that get in the way of being able to have a truly engaged and meaningful partnership relationship with local organizations because of the way that between the systems structure and compliance is structured and the things that are said, I'm using air quotes if you can see me in Zoom, the things that are said without necessarily being backed up by evidence, it shifts and necessarily influences the way we work. So with that, I'm going to ask Harriet. I'm going to put you on the spot, Harriet, as our first speaker today, but if you would get us started and speak a little bit from your perspective of how you work with local organizations and how you may have run into some of these myths and the impact that they have. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. From my perspective and experiences, I do identify with these myths because I have had donors, I have had civil society organizations speak about them. I have had non-government organizations as well as INGOs, including private sector in government, speak about these myths. So it is manifested in many ways. One of those ways is where we see donors, for example, move money from local organizations to, say, a government basket fund. Or we see local organizations, INGOs in government, requesting NGOs or local organizations to register, for example, with local governments and declare the kind of resources that they have so that they can be checked in the way they are utilized or in the way they are spent. There are also incidents where we have compulsory audits in a very short span of time, say quarterly, and that is also meant to probably check on fraud and mismanagement of funds in local entities. But the other common one is also where we work through identifying partners, and there is very big debate around local organizations and preference for INGOs, preference for very well established NGOs because of the assumed capacity that they have or ability to deal with issues of fraud and mismanagement of resources in all procurement. But I would like to say that local organizations, for me, are not just the ones that we could put in the limelight with these myths, but they are also evident in other entities, INGOs, they are evident in governments, they are evident in private sector. So what we do practically is ActionAid is, for example, to be one of the principles that we believe in is the capacity of local entities, because they know the context, they know the realities people live in, and therefore they become our primary source of information, primary source of data, in all the processes that we do that are participatory in nature, start with the knowledge that the local organizations have. So I will use one practical example here in Uganda, where we have what is called the quality assurance mechanism. Now, this quality assurance mechanism was developed by local NGOs for local NGOs. So it is a more proactive process of ensuring that local entities have the right capacity, have the right internal controls, they have the right processes, procedures, guidelines, and even capacity. So it is a process that you undergo as an entity and you're certified. So if you don't qualify significantly, you're given a partial certificate. If you're satisfactory, you're given a standard certificate. And if you really have very good policies in place, you're given advanced certificates. So this proactive process already puts local entities and prepares them to be ready to counter this kind of myths that may come by in these processes. The other second one that I can speak about is related to, say, procurement and compliance. Again, this is manifested in different ways, where you see donors and INGOs, for example, preferring to implement through intermediary organizations as a way of having control of how resources are managed, how programs are implemented, and who is doing what. You also have, we have incidences where they give a threshold of procurement. For example, anything above $5,000 should be, you give the specifications to the donor to procure. So putting restrictions around procurement has limited implementation, delays implementation in all ways. But what we have done is also to have proactive ways in which procurement can happen to debunk some of these assumptions. One of those is through community procurement processes. We involve communities in a participatory way to ensure that they actually identify what they want. They give us the specifications and we work with them and the local organizations to undertake the procurement. In that way, we are passing this capacity to the local organizations, we are passing over capacity to the communities, as well as strengthening their structures and systems on how procurement can happen. The other final one I can speak about is really the capacity of local organizations. And yes, it is a true myth, but I want to use a practical example that debunks this kind of feeling. Is there an example where we worked with an island community using a participatory approach that we have piloted as ActionAid that is called Societies Tackling AIDS Through Rights, and worked through 16 islands to develop priorities and what these communities would want to take forward in their programs. And one of the critical things they identified was a water ambulance or a water health service. And we came across a donor who said he needs a disruptive and creative idea from the community. So being prepared to counter this myth means we must be prepared with our right priorities. So we plugged into this donor and presented this issue, and it was presented by a community of people living with HIV/AIDS. So it means we put the reality of the people living with this injustice and problem at the center. And the donor was happy to fund this program with no restrictions. So they believed in the local capacity of people living in the islands and funded a health boat. And this health boat would run from one island to another, but had several facilities. This boat was doing advertising on the spaces on the boat so that we are not wasting the space on the boat. It was having awareness raising sessions. It was having health services. It was having, testing facilities on the same boat from one island to another. And in one of the sessions, they spoke about the importance of taxation and the contribution that communities make to the priorities that they had. And they managed again to add to the resources that were collected in terms of domestic revenue and purchased a land ambulance. So it means that if this donor had not believed in this community and the realities that the local organization presented, it would have been difficult to get this service prepared. So finally, I can speak about what we can do. Is one to believe in the local entities that they understand the circumstances further. So one of the slogans that we have is ActionAid. We say, go live with them, work with them, trust them, understand them. And at the end of the day, they will celebrate that we made a contribution to our community. So that has made our work very rooted. And so we put the local organizations at the center of all our partnerships that we undertake. Second one is accompanying this with the capacity building support. So it means that we don't end up discussing only the resource contribution that we make as ActionAid, but we also build the capacity of these local entities so that they become a model and good practice to other local entities in debunking some of the myths that we are speaking about. The other ways we do is participatory processes of developing policies, guidelines, procedures, so that they are part of those processes and can be supportive to other peer organizations in debunking the myths that we are talking about. So documenting good practices and asking those that are doing very well to support those that having gaps in these areas. The other way is also creating room for dialogue. When you have money, money comes with power. But how do we create room for dialogue to ensure that we speak to these people and listen to their realities before we make these conclusions around these myths, or even before we mistrust local entities? So sometimes when you get to dialogue with them, you understand the realities that they are living in them. So becoming flexible and adaptable to the realities of local entities is also a practice that we have as ActionAid, and that has made it easy for us to work with local entities. Then in instances where we cannot support the capacity of this organization, we have linkages because we are not just one player in this field. It means if we cannot provide these services, ActionAid, we could get World Vision, we could get to an organization that provides services, for example, as human rights defenders, so that we also look at a collective, contribution to enhancing capacity of local entities. So we believe that in everything that we do, we try to be as local as possible, but as internationally necessary in all the interventions that we undertake as ActionAid. Back to you, Christine.
Wow, Harriet, thank you. You covered so many things in what you've just said, and I've been jotting them down. I think the thing that really spoke to me about what you were saying is the importance of, it's not just an idea of the local partner is there to be dealt with once the program has been designed and take a very top-down, here you can do this. It is really, as you kept saying, the local partners need to be at the center. They need to be involved at all steps of the process. And I think when we are talking about locally led development, and here I'm really speaking and advocating also to donors, thinking about involving them from the design phase. It is not being involved once something has been designed and is put out on the street for bid. It is really saying, we're working with this community, we are working with these partners. They need to have authority and influence from the very first step in the process. Then they need to be built into the actual implementation in a way that is meaningful and credible. And you use the word trust, which is so important. We can't talk about locally led development if we're not talking about trust. I'm going to take something that you referred to, and Tessie, I'm going to throw this over to you. Harriet started out talking about all of these requirements that we have for local partners. And I say we donors, but it's also we INGOs. INGOs perpetuate a lot of this because they work within the system as it exists now. And so, for example, there are these compulsory audits. We know that local partners frequently will be hit with compulsory audits from every single donor, from every single partner they're working with. They have to have the capacity just to be able to run the audit process. The same thing we see when, if there is an RFA or an RFP on the street and INGOs look at themselves as primes who are bidding for this and they want to bring in local partners, they each have their own vetting system that they use with those local partners. If a local partner is considering working with has 4 or 5 different INGOs it might be considering, they have to go through that vetting process for each one of those because they are not standardized generally. So because of the way the systems are set up now, it strains the capacity of smaller organizations. It feeds into some of these myths that we are talking about today. So Tessie, could you speak to us from your perspective as the CEO of one of the largest global INGOs? And what are your thoughts around this? I know you've worked a lot in this space, not just with FHI 360 or with Plan USA where you were previously, but also with the sector as a whole. Tessie, over to you.
Hi, hey, Christine. Well, wow, that's a loaded question. And Harriet, thank you for your presentation. It was a marvelous way to start the panel. Right. So it's interesting that I'm at FHI 360 now after having been in Plan, and Christine, you and I work together in Plan. And so I just want to say one quick thing about, well, the problem is, these local organizations that they, somehow their capacity needs to be built because they don't have it. It's and that somehow there are all of these really intricate things that need to be known in order to be doing good work for a donor. And it has nothing, in my opinion, it's got very little to do with whether an organization is local or international. It has to do with whether the organization has experience working with a particular funder, a particular donor or not, and all of those particular funder rules. You know, to the point, you know, to my earlier point, so I worked for a very large INGO, which was planned, that had very little experience with the US government, and Christine knows this. And so it had nothing to do with local or international. It had to do with, you know, had you worked with this funder before? Because at the end of the day, you know, most INGOs, all they're doing are flowing down the requirements from their funder. Now, you're right that one of the things that we perhaps can do better as a community is, can we standardize, right, around what those, you know, what those vetting requirements are? That might be something that we as a community can do to really sort of facilitate things for all of the partners with which we're working, so that it doesn't become just trying to figure out how each of them works. But the other one is to be working with funders to make them aware, because, you know, to make them aware about what all of these requirements do and how they burden. And honestly, at the end of the day, they've got very little to do. One of your the third myth was, you know, the issue is that local entities can't deliver the, you know, don't know how to deliver technically. Of course they know how to deliver technically. What they don't know is exactly how the funder, what the, you know, what the funder thinks of as quality and all of the various things, you know, related to it. So it's got, I do worry about this whole localization, you know, effort. And what it, if it's not done right, what it can do with the best of intentions to local organizations who are already out there delivering a lot of very good value for their communities. And, you know, by coming in with a lot of funding and a lot of requirements, you know, we begin to honestly displace local priorities with the priorities of, you know, the funder, the donor, the INGO, and so on. So, you know, we need to, and I honestly, you know, FHI 360 is a very large implementer for PEPFAR. I have, and, you know, those of you, you know, with whom I've worked in the past know, I've had a number of concerns with how PEPFAR has gone about the whole task of, you know, localization. What PEPFAR is looking for, by and large, you know, over the last, and I think it's been accentuated over the last several years, is not necessarily good local partners that are doing good local work, but local entities that can do what they want to do. And this is exactly the opposite of what Harriet was describing, right? A process in which local organizations, local knowledge, you know, really is not just sort of brought in consultation, but really sort of leading the effort of design and implementation, not just some, you know, somebody that is consulted on the side, but by insisting on, you know, by and large, what have been pretty aggressive and unrealistic timeframes for getting work done, for you know, for transferring, you know, all the work locally. At the end of the day, I do get concerned that, you know, we can be in certain instances be doing more harm than good to local, you know, to local players, to local talent, you know, in the chase for, you know, in this case, you know, PEPFAR dollars. So I think there's a lot to unpack here. I think that's why this, you know, webinar is so useful. We all need to be mindful of, honestly, how we're working and the harm that we can be doing if we're not being careful with, you know, how we're being pushed, honestly, by funders oftentimes to, you know, to get things done. And so these are the types of things that individually implementing partners have a hard time pushing back against funders, but as a community, we have an opportunity to raise our voice and say, no, we shouldn't do it like this. This is what good localization, this is what good locally led development looks like. And don't let these myths get in the way.
Thank you, Tessie. Great commentary, and I think you're so right about this idea of, you know, the expectations that donors may set about how fast the timetable can work, and just wanting to check the box of the goals that they've set for themselves without actually building everything that needs to accompany that to set it up for success. And it becomes a perpetuating cycle if we see them say, you know, oh, we have to get our money out to local partners. They just try to work in the same framework. There are problems, and then they say, oh, well, there you go, we see these problems, and so we have to pull back. I'm going to move over to George. And George, I was wondering if you could build on what Harriet and Tessie have been talking about, anything particular you'd like to highlight, but also just from your perspective, have you seen changes, constructive shifts, positive developments, you know, over the last couple of years, over the last 5 years? Do you think that this is actually moving in the direction towards better locally driven, locally led development? Or are you not satisfied yet with what you're seeing? Over to you.
Thanks, Christine, and thanks to Harriet and Tessie for starting us off. I think that's a great way to start this conversation. So just building that on that, great points that have come from the two panelists. And I like the fact that we are all recognizing, and of course, every player in this sector is recognizing that, you know, the local actors at the center, and really not people who get pulled at the tail end of the project. And I think looking at the history of the development and humanitarian sector, I think we have seen a lot of great progress along these lines. I remember years back when, you know, you would be able to have INGOs coming with proposals and, you know, already laid out plans on what they want to do to particular communities, without really going through a proper assessment and ensuring that they understand the needs of that particular community. And so sometimes some of the prescriptions of the proposals really were not relevant to those particular communities. You come and try to implement the project and you don't realize the desired result. So I think this has really changed over the last couple of years. And of course, as we are all agreeing, we have seen increasingly many INGOs, the donors, recognizing the place of you know, the local actors. And I think there's been really a lot of drive to develop the capacity, support the local partners, and work together with them, as opposed to pulling them when you think it's convenient for them to be part of you. And I think it's really not just something that is driven by the INGOs and the donors alone, but I think even the regulatory authorities, you have seen a number of countries globally where you find the government agencies that are charged with you know, regulating the NGO sector, really trying to set standards on what they want to see and following through. For example, initially, I think in the past, we used to have a lot of briefcase NGOs, you know, just individual coming up and setting up a company and seeking for donor funding. And I think some of the regulatories are really looking into some of those particular issues to ensure that, you know, proper governance systems are in place and structures, and really the organization's mission and vision is aligned to the needs of those particular communities. Because ideally, some of the things that the development and humanitarian sector are doing are the primary responsibilities of the host government. So it's really not much of we are coming to do this for you, but they are also saying that, you know, as a host government, this is what we want to see within our community. So I think there's really been a lot of great effort towards that. I know it's a journey, and I'm glad that you know, we have to make these steps gradually. So I'm happy that there has been some progress that has been made in that particular line. And talking about even the governance of ensuring that we have the appropriate capacities and right focus for these particular organizations. I think there's been a lot in terms of ensuring that we have the governance systems in place on who needs to sit in those particular boards or in the organizations, at management levels. And I think that has really greatly improved in terms of the capacity of these particular local actors to really implement the programs that we have and really focus on the needs of the communities, because I think that is really, even though we are saying local actors are at the center, ideally the bottom line is those who are at the center are the beneficiaries of this particular program. So if whatever programs we are coming up with, the proposals are not addressing the core needs of those particular communities, then of course we are really not being helpful, and I think some of those programs might not really meet the intended objectives. So again, just referring back to what I know Harriet brought up about the trust and looking at the issues of intention, I think what is very important is to build a mutual trust between all the players. And of course, my understanding when we talk of the local actors really are not just the local organizations we are talking about. We have governments that are involved in this particular space as well. They have the primary objective. So a lot to do with how do we build mutual trust, among all the players in this particular field. For example, I know maybe there are certain cases where you find the local government might be a bit uncomfortable with particular programs in their respective jurisdictions. So some of these might be because they are not sure whether this is really the priority need for their communities. So, you have to build trust and ensure that we all are aligned in terms of the priorities and why we need to do this. So the intention is also very critical on why are we doing this? Why are we not passing, the funding through the government and are preferring to pass this through the INGOs? As we are looking at the development, I think lately I've seen a lot of shift, especially with the donors push to have the local actors, the local organizations, being the prime on some of these particular programs. And some of us in the INGO have been smart enough to convert our NGOs and have a local way. And I know some of the local governments, as I said, who are doing the regulation, have been focusing on that and really just trying to see on when we talk of this being a local institution, is it really a local institution, or is it just an arm or a wing of the international NGO? So I think those are some of the developments I see in the past. They are good because we are trying to ensure that even if it's appearing like a local wing of the INGO, the government is focusing on seeing how is the governance structured for this particular organization. The other thing I just wanted to point out, even as we talk about the INGOs and the local actors, is that all of these particular organizations are drawing their workforce, which is the primary driver to these particular programs, largely from the same environment. You will have a number of INGOs drawing their employees in the areas where we have the implementation of these particular programs. And those is still the same geographies from where we have, the workforce for these particular local organizations, and of course, even the governments that are also involved in this. So again, just bringing in the question, what then makes the difference? Because if you have the workforce from the same environment largely, why would we have disparity between how the INGOs are implementing and how the local organizations are implementing? So I think it's something that we may not have a straightforward answer, but I think brings in a larger question as to do with, is it a question of culture? How are we addressing the cultural risk in those particular environments where we operate? And then I think it's also important to recognize that some of the local organizations that we are talking about are not as established in terms of their years of experience and establishment as some of the INGOs that have been implementing over the years. Some of these have been established in the last few years, 5, 10 years or so, we are comparing this to the ability and the strength of INGOs that have been in existence for over 40 years, even 60 years. And I think then we may not be comparing the like. So again, just trying to recognize the fact that, it's a journey, and we probably need to continue to work together as partners so that, if you're a senior member of the family, you can always be able to support the junior members of the family so that we can work together. But we don't expect, a child that was born yesterday to run as fast as I could run. So I think it's not at that particular level, but what can we be able to do so that they can then be able to adapt to the environment? So I think that's a great important piece that we need to consider, even as we look at how we can continue to empower the local actors and ensure that they are in a position to continue to implement the programs that have been traditionally implemented by the INGOs, or to work in partnership in that particular line to achieve the same objective. Thanks. I think I'll stop at this, and over to you, Christine. Thank you. Thank
you so much, George. I'm going to just hold on to that last point that you were making about, and Tessie referred to this as well. Some of this is not international or local. It is around the depth of experience and just the number of years, or the number of interactions you've had with a particular donor, how well you are able to build your systems to work with that donor, how well you are able to speak language that that donor is requiring to be able to have the right conversations with the donor. One thing that I think we certainly see, and this is with newer organizations everywhere, is that when you are getting your first grant or maybe your second grant with a donor, you are probably less likely to push back on some of their requirements, because you're saying, oh, I've got a foot in the door. I don't want to jeopardize this. I'm going to do what they're telling me to do, even if it doesn't make sense to us or it is a burden to us. Whereas we see that with organizations that have longer experience, they also have, I think, louder voices with those donors to push back. One of the things that Humentum has acknowledged, and we are hopefully going to be working towards, is the idea that we are already working with INGOs on advocacy with donors around these administrative hurdles and challenges and burdens and operational challenges. We know that whether it's a local organization or a newer organization, whatever label you want to give, there is not that same sort of collective advocacy happening yet that would allow them to have a weightier voice with donors around locally led development and how donors are engaging in localization. And we are hoping to support that because we think that is very important. With that, I'm going to turn to Haidy. And Haidy, we had a question in the chat around, or question comment around the legal and fiduciary responsibilities of donors that they then pass on to the organizations that are implementing with their funds. And we can use the US government as an example. The money that the US government is allocating towards global development is coming from US taxpayers. We know very well that there is a conversation every year around how much money the Congress will put into that allocation. And USAID and other development agencies or agencies engaging in development within the US government talk about needing to be good stewards of the money. They have fiduciary responsibility. And so on the one hand, we have to recognize this. And on the other hand, we see that this places a burden on the execution of funds. And so you were a finance person, and I would be interested in your thoughts on how, on the one hand, you really need to work to maintain that fiduciary responsibility. And on the other hand, you want to be expanding how, in your case, World Vision partners with local entities, how World Vision uses its funds for greatest impact. Can you speak to that from that fiduciary responsibility perspective? Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Christine. And yeah, thanks for the previous speakers. Just to build in on that, to debunk some of this myth, and also at the question that you posed on about the fiduciary responsibilities, I would say from my experience working alongside with the local organizations, first of all, I think this myth, this stereotype that fraud and corruptions, and then the ability to handle the procurements, and then also the ability to implement the program. We cannot generalize that. I mean, yeah, this came because of, I think, one of two experience, and then even ourselves, I mean, the NGO communities, we oftentimes we just use that one or two bad experience to generalize that. Talking about the the responsibility on that, I would say that there's a capacity assessment too. I mean, you don't really go and partner with, yeah, I mean, all organizations before you do the proper capacity assessments. But there is a huge role, I think, that we have to play, where we have to build up the capacities and of the local local actors, and then the things that what I think the previous speaker says about the experience as well. I mean, yeah, oftentimes you will find that the organizations that have been having experience with the specific donors, then for the next one, then there's already prepared, and our role when we are partnering with them, I mean, we will really need to build the capacities. We set a fund, I mean, specific fund just to do this kind of capacity building, because we know the sustainability of the program is actually when we do it with the local actor as well. And then talking about fraud, talking about the misconduct of the finance, I would say frauds happen in all organizations, whether it is international, whether it's local, it happens. From my experience, I mean, just a recent experience I had where World Visions, we are leading a consortium of with 2 NGOs members and then 2 local organizations. And what we experience is the fraud is actually discovered in the INGO, one of the INGO, which we claim has a better system. So while it's true that many local organizations do not have well-established system, but not for all. For example, in Uganda, I would say, as per the INGO Bureau, I mean the regulators, there are over 10,000 non-profit organizations registered. And many of the local organizations, they are actually doing excellent work, both at the program, the accountability side, and they are really committed to the humanitarian and development work. Yeah, and talking about the governance, I think George talked about that too. You were really surprised. I mean, some of the local organizations, they have the independent board governance that provide the oversight. And you know, the board governance is in the country where I mean, they can provide this kind of close oversight in terms of the audit, in terms of the accountability, which is we found that it's really, I mean, some of us international NGO, we have our board governance is not in the country, where they do have that in the country. And then, yeah, from the experience also how, I mean, the development here in the country that I work, like in Uganda, in one of the biggest refugee camp, where refugee settlements where World Vision is managing the food distributions, we are working hand in hand with 2 local organizations, which is independent. They are not our sub-grantee or what, but we are working together in that settlement. And it's really, I can say that they are really doing very, very well. They are front in there. And then also looking at the entire, the wider space in Uganda, where we have, I think, 13 or 14 refugee camps, over 1 million refugees, and half of them are now, for the food distributions program, are being managed by these local organizations. Yes, I would say it is not happen overnight, a year, but we started from 4-5 years back, where we build the capacities and then also gain the trust from the donors. And then now they are the one who actually perform that work. So I would say all is really about the experience and also the role of different stakeholder. Us, I mean, the older brother, as just mentioned, that we play our role to build their capacities and then let them be independent. I mean, accessing the donor funding. We started with taking them as our partner in a consortium, but the aim should be we build their capacity, and in the next opportunity, then they should go as an independent entity to the donors. Yeah. And then the other thing is about procurement. I think really I want to talk about that too. Yeah, I think one common misconceptions, the myth, if we are talking about to debunk this thing, is that the local organizations, they do not have capacity to engage with the donor procurements and then with the compliance. Well, again, I mean, we should not generalize that. Yes, most local organizations, they do not have that complex procurement system or structure who does that, but it doesn't mean that they are not able to engage with the procurements or to comply with the donor rules. Again, it's back to the capacity and also it's back to the experience. Really, I mean, from my experience working in different countries, working closely with these local actors, yeah, when you give them the opportunity, I mean, being our partners, or when the organization has experience one with the specific donors, then for the next one, they will build up their capacities and they will know that this is what required from the donors. But if we don't give them the opportunity, then we actually blocking them from to develop or establish themselves. So I will stop here, Christine, from what I will share from my experience. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Heidi. Yeah, and I think that what you've been talking about and some of the comments we're getting in the chat, these are all really tied together. I want to address one question that's come up now twice in the chat, which is, why do we just have representatives of INGOs in this panel? Now, there are two different ways to look at this question. One is, yes, the people we have in this panel are from INGOs. The other is that none of us was born into an INGO. We all come from somewhere. And I know that we have several panelists here who have worked locally within their own communities, have worked for local and national NGOs, and are now actually, in the case of Harriet, I think you are Ugandan, you're working for an international organization or a global organization, but you are working in your own countries. So everyone brings multiple perspectives to what they do at the office, because we are human beings with complex identities and not just who we are when we are at the office on a given day. And I know that we bring the experience of how we've worked in the past into the job that we may occupy right now. So that's one way to answer this. The second way to answer this is that Humentum has a really strong membership of mostly INGOs, and we are in the process of shifting and expanding the way that we work and support local and national NGOs. We do not yet have as wide and strong a network of local and national NGOs as we aspire to having. And I invite you a year from now, 2 years from now, to check in with us and see how we are working, because you will see changes. But right now, we worked on identifying people who we thought would bring great perspective to this panel. We have wonderful panelists. And I hope in the subsequent webinars and in the work that we do, we will really be able to elevate and amplify the voices of local and national NGOs in exactly these kinds of discussions. So please hold me to that. Come back and check with us, and we will continue to be building out how we engage as well. I want to shift. We've talked about fiduciary responsibility. We've talked about some compliance issues. One thing that I think, again, we've seen in the chat reference to And I want to plug some work that Humentum has been doing is around indirect cost recovery, or how organizations cover their administrative costs. This is an area where we know that local and national organizations tend to be shut out or to be handicapped because they are not getting the same kind of indirect cost recovery that international organizations, longer established organizations, are able to get. This is because it is a complex negotiation process with donors. Donors have what they call a de minimis policy. USAID and the US government has a de minimis policy where an organization that does not have an established NICRA will only get 10% of their administrative costs covered. That is not sufficient to cover how much it costs to run their business. Humentum has been doing work on this with a large cohort of local and national organizations. We will be launching the results of this work next month. So I'm very excited about this because it is really, I will say it, it is groundbreaking work in that it provides real evidence about how the lack or the weakness of indirect cost recovery handicaps local organizations. Just some quick findings from that. Most funders are providing inadequate cover of their grantees' administration costs. Inadequate cost coverage and limited access to unrestricted income makes it challenging for most NGOs to achieve sound financial health. And in order to stop trapping grantees in this starvation cycle, organizations need full cost coverage. They need access to unrestricted reserves, and they need to support to strengthen the way that they structure their cost recovery capabilities. Nothing I said is a surprise to any of these panelists, I'm sure, or to most of you in the room, but we haven't had really strong data and evidence to back this up. And that evidence is coming, and I hope that it's going to stimulate a really data-driven discussion at the donor level around what it's going to take to actually allow organizations to cover their costs, build their leadership, build their systems the way they need to be built to be able to be active and full participants in all of this. And with that, somebody has just put into the chat, the elephant in the room that we have not talked about is power relations. I think we've touched on it somewhat, but I would invite any of our panelists, and actually now again, I just said anyone, but I'm going to pick on George. George, you work in audit. You know what it means to have power when you come into an office and say, I'm going to be looking at how you've been running things. But you also know from the programmatic perspective and from the partner perspective, what it means to want to have trusting relationships. And you've talked already about this. Can you talk a little bit about power dynamics and that balance between what the donor is asking for, the power wielded by the donor, and how you work in your audit capacity and how you see this affecting your partnership with local organizations?
Thanks, Christine. Well, in terms of the power dynamics, I would say that this, I know, has been something that has been out there for a long time, and it keeps taking different shape. I'm actually glad that the conversation that you are having now on the locally led development is largely driven by some of the donors, especially USAID. And I think that's a great, move, because then really they are taking the lead in ensuring that, even though we have the power, but we are saying, yes, can we work a lot more with them, the local organizations, because you have great experience, you understand your local context, and you have great, human resource, the proximity to where we work, you better understand your needs. And so they're saying, can we have increasingly more resources going directly to the local entity. So I think that in itself is a great effort on seeing the donor themselves also getting into play on that. And I think that there's been evolution on this over the last couple of years, which is, I think, is a good thing. But of course, again, the expected results, the output cannot be realized in a short time. It also calls for a lot of, capacity development on the part of the local actors, so that they also get to feel like, when we come to negotiate around the table, we are not coming as lesser partners in this particular program, but we are coming as people who equally have something important that we are bringing on the table, and which I think will be helpful for the delivery of this. And I think that then would be able to help even in terms of issues of negotiating for the indirect cost rates and covering the overhead costs and the administrative costs, which I think again also I would say that there has been great effort, because the demeanors that we have now, for example, with the US government of the 10% was not there several years back. And we see that is now in place. So I think as we are moving along, we are seeing some effort also to bring the other local actors into place onto the table and take their position. But I think a lot more still needs to be done, because most of the times there's a feeling of a push from the donors that, if they don't agree with your position, then obviously you have to either go their way or you part ways. So I think that's one important part that we still a lot needs to be done. And so you find situations where the local actors will probably maybe just give in to the demands of the donors simply because, if we don't give in, then they are going to, part ways with us. And sometimes because of the resource constraints at the partner level, the local organization level, I think they are like, now we just have to accept for the sake of getting the money. But I think this is where now empowerment is also very critical, because even when we respond to some of the call for proposals, we should be clear that, is this aligned with our mission? Is this aligned with our priorities? Are we going in for it simply because we need the money? Or do we find this really relevant to us and focus on the right things that we want to see for our communities that we are serving? Because I think it's a reality that there are some organizations that have always tried to respond. If they find a proposal in this particular way and they need the money, they will be able to tailor their objectives, tailor their focus to ensure they can be able to attract the funding from that particular end. But does it really align with our mission and vision? So again, going back to issues of the resource constraints, because some of the local organizations are not well established, they are lacking resources, and they cannot be able to attract, the best of the workforce that they need to have in these organizations to sit on the table and negotiate on their behalf. So sometimes they really just give in. So I think these are areas that we still need to work on. And that brings me to the issue of, when we talk of the fundraising, are we then just focused to, the donor funding? Are there other alternatives that the local organizations should be looking at in terms of building their resource base, so that they are able to hire and retain, competent personnel who can sit around the table, but also they can be able to run with some of the things without necessarily just depending on the donor 100%. I want to just share one example before I stop on, organization that I had an experience with. I served on the board as a local organization before, and I could see clearly, the drive is, how do we recover the cost? And because the donor does not accept to, any indirect cost to be approved on the project, they will be able to find creative ways of how they are going to recover the cost. So sometimes some of the costs that they bill, whether they are personnel costs, may not necessarily be personnel costs as such, will not be paid to the employees, but they will find that a creative accounting of how they can be able to plow back this money and bill for them a reserve that they can then be able to use, during the leaner time. So it's not ethical, but why are they doing this? It's because the focus is simply on the donor. So I think this is one thing that we also need to see on how best can our local organizations also begin looking at other ways of building their resource capacity without necessarily just depending on the donors. Thanks, and over to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, George. And I've got hands from both Harriet and Tessie. So Harriet, over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. I just wanted to share an ActionAid example that we have actually a cost recovery policy that we have used since 2019. So it would also be a good practice for organizations to develop cost recovery policies, because in this process, we actually budget for everything that we require. Then the second comment I have is around how we manage negotiations on costs. I would also encourage that through ActionAid practice, we do a lot of proactive fundraising. When you do proactive resource mobilization, it means it's possible that you can reach the donor before they actually get out the call for proposals. Normally, when the call for proposals comes, it's already fixed and has, you know, conditionalities that you need to meet. But when you get to the donor in a more proactive way, it is possible to have certain things negotiated beforehand, and you can manage the percentages and the cost recovery issues. Then the other one, I saw a question around the system that I talked about. It is called the quality assurance mechanism. I did mention that it was done by local entities in Uganda for local entities in Uganda. So it is a process that you go through to assess your systems, your processes, policies, staffing, capacity, so that it puts you to a level that can give confidence to a donor or to somebody that wants to relate with you, that you are a credible entity, that you're legitimate, that you are accountable, and that you will be an efficient entity. So when they give you certification, it means you have already met those standards. So it's not yet registered anywhere, but more practiced in Uganda. And I think it is a more proactive way of preparing yourself and cleaning your house before these meets come to meet you along the way. They really clear a lot of processes and make you understand your capacity very, very well. But also in the process, the quality assurance mechanism ensures that they identify people with good practices who can support other local organizations. So for example, ActionAid at some point actually received an advanced certificate. It means we already had most of these parameters that are required of this process. So it can be a reference point to learn from. So when you come to learn from ActionAid, that does not require money. So how do we also explore capacity enhancement processes that are not necessarily funded? Yeah, so the challenge sometimes is we want capacity that is funded, but how do you explore those that you can get online, probably offered free of charge, peer-to-peer support mechanisms that, for example, comes out of this one process that somebody just asked about in the chat. So I thought I needed to respond to those.
Thank you, Harriet. I just want to ask you one more question about the quality assurance certificate. You said it isn't registered yet. Are donors in Uganda, for example, if I went to USAID Uganda and said, do you know about this certificate? Do you think that they would say, oh yes, we know what it is? Or is that a dialogue that needs to get started?
I would say maybe about 50%, because the organization that hosts the quality assurance mechanism is a network of indigenous organizations in Uganda. And mostly promotes it for local entities. But I think we still have a lot of work to ensure that actually most donors understand that this mechanism is in place, because it has been supported by several donors, but I cannot say if you ask everybody, they will say yes. But right. It has worked that some donors actually require that you present a quality assurance mechanism certificate before they give you a certain form of funding. So maybe more work needs to around it.
Okay, no, and that's a great example of how something really valuable is being built from the people who need it the most. The important thing then is getting it accepted, because if it's not known, it won't do a whole lot of good. But I think it's great that we now have that as an example that we can all think about, and I bet you're going to be getting some follow-up questions about it from all the people on this call, including Humentum. So let me shift over to Tessie.
Yeah, thanks, Christine, and really good conversation, really good comments on the chat. So just maybe 3 observations from me. One is I did, to the point about shifting funder or donor, sort of perspectives and preferences. I did want to give a shout out to, I'm sure, a policy that all of you are familiar with, the draft USAID local capacity development policy, which I honestly think is a pretty significant shift from, well, what I referred to earlier, sort of the PEPFAR approach to localization, which is about sort of creating, local entities that can, that can be mini-me's, right? Entities that are not about, it's not about strengthening local capacity to achieve local priorities, but somebody else's, priorities. And the, while there, certainly as FHI 360 and in my capacity as a co-chair of MFAN, we submitted a lot of comments to this local capacity development policy, but it's worth recognizing that it's a very big step in the right direction. It is much, really about being demand driven, acknowledging sort of that it takes, there is a sort of a long-term process about this. It doesn't happen automatically and so on. So I think, and this is a really good example of the community coming together to really push, funders to think differently, and sort of the power of, collective advocacy here is just something, we can all individually, and, we've got great examples here about how individually organizations in this virtual room, what they're doing to support localization, but there's also power in what we can do collectively to push on locally led development and localization. Related to this, a lot is being said, right, about, building the capacity of local organizations. We ought to remember that we have a lot of capacity to develop ourselves, right? That if we want locally led development to work, we need to rethink how we work, and really sort of shift that whole thing. And we've discussed some of the ways that, we can do that, including vetting systems and so on. But there's a lot of new skills and new capacities, new ways of thinking that we need to develop internally, all of us in the INGO community, because if we're part of, I guess we're part of the problem. I mean, these myths didn't come up from nowhere. These are myths that, to a certain extent over time, we've perpetuated, knowingly or unknowingly. But, if we're part of the problem, we're part of the solution. And I guess one last observation, it's been, talked about in some of the chat comments, about, sort of funders wanting to be good stewards and so on. And at times, I'm in conversations where, sort of the implication is that there's some sort of a trade-off, right, between, quality or, or compliance and localization. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I do think that changing the dynamics, power shifting, real locally led development will require, like I said, that we, we shift our own thinking, we build new capacities, new skills, and honestly, that we rethink our risk appetite, which is fine, right? But it has to be intentional, and it doesn't happen automatically. So it's just a reflection here, and it's been said, well, why don't we have, local NGOs? Christine gave a very articulated, really well articulated response to why that was the case. But I also think it's because we've got work to do here as an international community. And it starts with conversations like this. So thanks.
Thank you, Tessie. Heidi, you've got your hand up, and I'm going to call on you, but I'm just going to flag for everyone. We have 15 more minutes in our allotted time. We have been pulling questions in from the chat as we go, so I think that we've done pretty well covering these different issues. But if you have a question or a comment that you would like us to see and bring into these last minutes of discussion, please make sure to put it in the chat now so that we are able to take it into account. So with that, Heidi, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Christian. So I just want to add on some of the observation as well, and also the questions posed on the chat, how the INGO and national NGO work together. We are talking about the cost recovery as well. I think one thing that is quite important is the inclusions and the equity. I think equity between us, I mean the international organizations, NGOs, and also with the local actors. I mean, it's many times, I mean, we have kind of a little bit exclusive. We have our INGO communities forum in the country, but how we can involve, I mean, bring in together, I mean, NGO, whether it's international, whether it's local, and we discuss the thing together. We discuss the same agenda when we are talking about pushing the cost recovery. Then when we are bringing in the national organizations, I mean, the local NGO in the table, and we discuss the same thing, I think that is where we can find the solutions and can push the thing together as the organizations, I mean, as a development actors. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, we can't work alone. INGO, they can't work alone. We need the local actors where know the local context better. They are down in the community, and then there are more sustainability there. So I think there need to be inclusions in all this agenda in the forum in the country. So that's what I want to add.
Thank you, Heidi. Yeah, I wanted to come back to the idea of, you know, what can we be doing now to actually change the narrative and to actually take action to move towards locally led development. And, you know, we haven't actually stopped and talked about what locally led development is. It's a term that we use. We also talk about localization. We know that different donors define it in different ways. There was some reference in the chat to what is a local organization? How do you define that? I think Heidi spoke about, you know, I think it was Heidi, about the difference between, you know, that you have the wing of an international organization or you've got a local organization, that may make some difference in the eyes of the donor, you know, those sorts of distinctions. What I want to be specific about here is, you know, it is about power. It is about authority. So it is at the design phase. It is at the influence phase. How do you actually just influence the donor in terms of how they're thinking about spending their money? And then what that looks like, which is design. And then what that RFP or RFA or bid or whatever it is looks like. And especially because there's frequently a comment period where they do invite comment. You know, how do those voices from local and national actors get heard? So it's about voice, authority, it's about decision making, it's about budgetary authority and stewardship. All of these things, if we are talking about power shifting, but we are not talking about shifting those things, then we're not actually talking about making a change. If you just say, oh, my organization now has a national, as a country director, but that person doesn't have budgetary authority, does not have hire and fire authority, does not have decision-making authority, that is not a change. That is tokenism, that is symbolic. So let me ask you all, we've got 20 minutes, we've got 10 minutes left. It's 20 minutes past the hour here. I would like each of you to give us one idea. If you could say something to the donor, or if you could make a change today or tomorrow, you know, what would that highest priority be for you? I am going to start with, here, I'm just going to give you an order. I'm going to start with Tessie, and then George, and then Heidi, and I'm going to finish with Harriet. We started with you and we'll finish with you. So think about this as your last words to the group today, but, you know, really, what would you prioritize? Tessie, I'm putting you on the spot.
Wow, what would I tell the donors? Well, I've already told them. I mean, we there is a wholesale shift of mentality to, that funders, need to, need to make happen in themselves. To your point, Christine, it really is about how things are designed, who is invited to the table, what your own sort of rules are, and so on. So it's a pretty wholesale shift in mentality that does need to happen. And I think we've been talking about it, so I don't really have more to offer in that regard. I will make one quick comment. Somebody had a chat comment about the grand bargain. And, by and large, we've been talking here about development. And it's worth, considering how all of this plays out in humanitarian settings, because it doesn't play out the same. And the irony of it all, in my opinion, is that the grand bargain was talking about localization and locally led processes, well before we all engaged in it as a development community, in my opinion. But what happens is that we constantly displace the desire to localize with the urgency to respond. And as humanitarian actors, and now as we're facing, what is a absolutely heartbreaking situation in Ukraine, in addition to everything that we have been seeing in Afghanistan, Tigray, and so on, it's worth, considering the role of localization, locally led development, and all of these processes that we have been discussing, and how we shift that conversation also in humanitarian settings. Because by and large, my organization included, we have not been thinking enough about it. It is something that INGOs need to do, and we need to sort of recommit ourselves and also re-engage funders and donors in this conversation.
Thank you, Tessie. George, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Good points there, Tessie. Thank you. Maybe just picking up on that, I think looking at the myths that we have been addressing the last couple of minutes, if we are talking about matters of fraud and mismanagement, we are talking of the compliance and, with the donor procurement and other regulations, we are talking the capacity to implement the project. I think I like one, of course, the document that was prepared by Save the Children and Oxfam about transforming the US foreign assistance and the power of ownership. I think really, if we want to change this, we need to give greater authority to the local organizations. Just like you said earlier, Christine, if we are just creating structures or organizations just to meet the donor requirements, we are really not going to meet these desired results. And when you have great authority, you expect greater results and greater achievement. And of course, all of us will be able then to realize the intended objective. So I think that's one thing that really the donors need to do. And looking at what would be creating these myths, when we talk of fraud and we talk of mismanagement, what is creating this? And it just reminds me about the fraud triangle, trying to look at, is it a question of the motivation or an opportunity or the rationalization of these particular fraud schemes? What are the causes of these particular issues, and how can we be able to address that? But then I know I still have a question as to whether that is really backed by facts, that we have greater fraud and mismanagement and the capacity issues at the local organizations. It's more of the mindset that we need to change and bring these people to the table with honesty to contribute and participate in this particular process. In that way, if we hold hands, we are able to move together. But if we load it over them, and then of course they will find creative ways of how they want to go around and achieve their objectives because their hands have been tied. So let's have open dialogue on the table with these particular local players and address the real cause of some of these particular concerns that we have, so that then we can be able to move together as a team. I know when we talk of ensuring that we have the right capacities, building the systems, some of these particular issues requires resources. So again, let's give the necessary resources that are required to build the systems and the infrastructure that will be able to help these particular organizations to deliver to the mandate on the projects as is expected. Thanks, and over.
Yes, thanks, Josh. There's two things to the donor, I think, from my side. One is value for money, and two is the sustainability development. Value for money, local organizations is cheaper, I mean, in terms of the operational costs, the administrative costs. They don't have a lot of bureaucracy here and there. And then sustainability, because they have the country knowledge. They are there, they stay with the community. So if we are talking a long-term development, they are the key players. But of course, there's the risk aspect there. I will talk about the risk. Yeah, I saw the chat also, someone are mentioning about risk tolerance. I think working with the local NGO, we must be balanced between the sustainability and the ownership of these local actors bring into the development. And it is a time, it is a journey. I mean, it's a process where we build a capacity, we establish them, and it is a role of all of us. I mean, as a stakeholder, whether donors, international NGO who is in the space earlier, then I think we all have that role to play. Thank you.
Thanks. And from me, I would say to the donors and all actors in this field, let local organizations take the lead in their own language and voice, because they are in the lived reality, but this should be accompanied by flexible funding mechanisms to support the closing of these gaps around capacity and to debunk some of these myths that we are talking about, so that these funding mechanisms can change the status quo of the local organizations and they get more rooted and stronger and have the capacity to deliver. But also the emphasis around believing in local knowledge, because in all instances, even if it is humanitarian response, it is these local actors that reach there before INGOs or anyone else. So they understand the context and the realities. So let's believe in the local knowledge. And I will summarize that by saying that let us be as local as possible and as international as necessary. Back to you, Kristen.
So thank you so much, Harriet, Heidi, George, Tessie, for these final words, but also everything you've contributed to this discussion today. I think it's been great. I want to thank all of our participants, everyone who put something into the chat. Really, we appreciate it. It makes our conversations that much richer, and it really brings other voices into this discussion. I will say that is one of the things that I love about doing remote Zoom-based convening, because we can actually, work in additional voices to the panel while we're doing this discussion. So that is great, and I want to thank everyone. I'm going to call out one of our final contributions to the chat. Stephanie Calvis said, we need to change the narrative around local actors from risk to asset. And I want to add that as a really important idea on top of what we've heard today. I think everything that everyone was saying today goes in that direction. But let's have asset-based thinking. Let's think about how much we learn. Heidi gave a great example about, value for money. If you've got people who know the local context and who know how things work, they should be doing the design. They should be having their voice heard, as Harriet just said. So let's move in that direction. I hope that today's webinar has been inspiring, provocative, and also practical. I think we have talked about practical aspects of this, and I hope it may have given some of you ideas that you may take back to your jobs and roles that you may be able to use immediately or somewhere down the line. So with that, we are at time. I really want to thank our panelists again for taking the time. It is great to see you. I love being part of these webinars and having these discussions. And thanks again to all of our participants and for your contributions. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. We will be having a Humentum members only locally led development session in the month of April, and then another open to everyone session in the month of May, and then in July and onwards. So thank you all, and be well, be safe, and see you next time. Bye-bye.